The mathematics of dying at sea were simple. A Japanese Type 95 torpedo weighed nearly 2 tons and carried a warhead packed with 900 pounds of explosive. It moved through the water at 49 knots, faster than any ship in the American fleet. When it struck steel, it did not simply punch a hole. It broke ships in half. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb had watched it happen 3 months ago, standing helpless on the bridge of the USS Radford while a transport ship called the Gregory folded like paper and sank in 11 minutes. 1,200 men went into the water that night. 800 of them drowned before the rescue boats arrived. Now Webb stood at the plotting table in the Combat Information Center, studying the green glow of the radar scope while his sonar operator fed him bearing reports. The convoy behind them stretched across 3 miles of ocean, 8 transport ships carrying the 3rd Marine Division toward Bougainville. Somewhere ahead, hidden beneath the black water of the Coral Sea, Japanese submarines were waiting. The year was 1943, and the rules of Pacific warfare had already been written in blood. American destroyers were supposed to screen convoys from a distance, using their speed and sonar to detect submarines before they could attack. They were supposed to be careful. Cautious. They were supposed to survive. Webb had stopped believing in careful. "Contact bearing 045, said Tommy Briggs, the 19-year-old sonar operator from Kansas. His voice cracked slightly. He had been listening to the ocean for 36 hours straight, wearing headphones that pressed red marks into his skull. "Range approximately 2,000 yards. Sounds like an I-class boat, sir. He's making turns for attack speed. 2,000 yards. In calm water, a Type 95 torpedo could cover that distance in roughly 90 seconds. The submarine was positioning itself for a shot at the lead transport, the USS President Hayes, which was carrying 3,000 Marines and enough ammunition to level a small city. Webb looked at the men around him. Chief Boatswain's Mate Earl Harrison, who was 44 years old and had survived the fall of the Philippines. Ensign David Nakamura, the Japanese-American officer from Hawaii who manned the depth charge station and spent every day proving his loyalty to men who still looked at him with suspicion. They were waiting for orders. They were waiting for him to do what destroyer captains were supposed to do: maintain distance, protect the convoy, wait for the submarine to reveal itself. But waiting meant watching. And watching meant counting the minutes until another transport ship broke apart and another 1,000 men learned what it felt like to drown in the dark. "Helm," Webb said quietly, "come to course 045. All ahead flank." The helmsman hesitated. "Sir, that's directly toward the contact." "I know." The Radford was a Fletcher-class destroyer, 2,100 tons of American steel powered by 4 boilers that could push her through the water at 35 knots. She carried 5 5-inch guns, 10 torpedo tubes, and enough depth charges to crack open the ocean floor. But she was not armored. Her hull was 3/8 of an inch thick. A single torpedo hit would kill her as surely as it would kill any transport. The engine room answered the order. The deck began to vibrate as 30,000 horsepower surged through the twin propeller shafts. Webb felt the ship surge forward, accelerating toward the hidden submarine like a bullet leaving a barrel. Chief Harrison appeared at his elbow. The old sailor's face was carved from decades of Pacific sun and salt spray. He did not ask questions. He simply said, "Depth charges are ready, Captain." "Good." Webb kept his eyes on the plotting board. "We're going to run straight down his throat." The tactic had a name among destroyer crews who had tried it and lived. They called it becoming a torpedo, charging directly at an enemy submarine so fast that its own weapons became useless. Japanese torpedoes needed several hundred yards to arm their warheads. If the Radford could close the distance before the submarine fired, those torpedoes would pass beneath her hull as harmless as driftwood. If the submarine fired early, the geometry of interception became impossible. A target moving at 35 knots directly toward you was nearly unhittable. It was insane. It was mathematics. And sometimes, in war, those were the same thing. "Torpedo in the water." Briggs shouted. "Bearing 043, incoming." Webb did not flinch. He watched the plot, calculating angles and speeds in his head the way he had once calculated equations in a Virginia classroom that now felt like it belonged to another man's life. Hard right rudder. Steady on 050. The destroyer heeled sharply, throwing men against bulkheads. Webb grabbed the edge of the table and held on while the ship carved a tight arc through the waves. Outside, invisible in the darkness, a torpedo was racing toward them at nearly 50 knots, a cylinder of death that would either miss them by inches or tear them apart. The next 30 seconds would decide everything, and Marcus Webb discovered that he was no longer afraid. The torpedo passed 17 feet below the keel. Ensign David Nakamura saw its wake, a faint green phosphorescence cutting through the black water like a scar. He was standing at the depth charge racks on the stern, hands gripping the release lever, and for 2 full seconds he believed with absolute certainty that he was about to die. The explosion would come from below. The deck would split open. The sea would rush in and pull him down into the darkness where Japanese submarines hunted American ships and American ships hunted Japanese submarines, and everyone pretended there was something noble about killing men you would never see. The explosion did not come. The torpedo's magnetic exploder had been calibrated for a deeper target, a transport ship with a draft of 30 feet, not a destroyer riding high in the water. The weapon passed beneath the Radford like a ghost and vanished into the night, its warhead still armed, searching for something to kill until its fuel ran out and it sank to the bottom of the Coral Sea. Missed, someone shouted from the bridge. He missed. But Nakamura did not celebrate. He was watching the water, counting seconds, waiting for the next torpedo. Because he understood something that many sailors never learned until it was too late, Japanese submarine commanders were not fools. They did not fire single shots. They fired spreads, 4 torpedoes, sometimes 6, fanning out across the water to catch targets that tried to dodge. Second torpedo bearing 040. Briggs' voice crackled over the intercom. Third torpedo 048. Fourth torpedo 052. 4 torpedoes. The submarine commander had fired his entire forward salvo at once, gambling everything on one massive attack. Lieutenant Commander Webb had perhaps 15 seconds to thread the Radford through a wall of death. Down in the plotting room, Webb's mind was racing through calculations. The Fletcher-class destroyer had a turning radius of roughly 600 yards at flank speed. The torpedoes were spread across an arc of 12 degrees. If he turned too sharply, he would present his full broadside to at least one of them, a perfect target. If he held course, the innermost torpedo would catch him amidships. There was only one option, and it was exactly the kind of insanity that made destroyer captains either heroes or corpses. Hard left rudder. All engines back emergency. The helmsman obeyed instantly. The Radford shuddered as her propellers reversed, fighting against her own momentum. The bow swung hard to port while the ship slowed from 35 knots to 20 in a matter of seconds. Metal groaned. Somewhere below, a boiler technician was thrown against a steam pipe and would carry the burn scar for the rest of his life. The first torpedo passed ahead of the bow. The second torpedo passed astern. The third and fourth torpedoes bracketed the destroyer so closely that men on deck could have reached out and touched them, and then the sea was empty, and the Radford was still floating, and Webb was already giving new orders. All ahead flank. Come to original bearing. Prepare depth charges. The submarine had fired everything. Japanese I-class boats carried 6 forward torpedo tubes and 12 reserve torpedoes, but reloading underwater took 20 minutes under ideal conditions. For the next 20 minutes, the submarine had no fangs. It could only run. Chief Harrison was at Webb's side, his weathered face showing something that might have been admiration. He's going deep, Captain. Trying to hide under the thermal layer. The thermal layer, a boundary in the ocean where warm surface water met cold deep water. Sound behaved strangely at that boundary, bending and scattering in ways that made sonar tracking nearly impossible. Japanese submarine commanders had learned to use it as a hiding place, diving to 400 feet or more and lying silent while American destroyers searched blindly above, but Webb had spent 6 months studying Japanese tactics. He knew that the thermal layer was not a wall. It was a ceiling. And ceilings could be broken. Set depth charges for 350 feet, he ordered. Pattern Alpha. We're going to crack him open. The Radford raced toward the submarine's last known position. At the stern, Nakamura and his crew worked the depth charge racks with practiced efficiency. The Mark 7 depth charge weighed 600 pounds and contained 300 pounds of TNT. When it exploded at the preset depth, it created a pressure wave that could crush a submarine's hull like an aluminum can. Contact directly below. Briggs called. He's at 320 feet and descending. Webb waited. The destroyer passed over the submarine's position, a shadow crossing a shadow, Hunter becoming the hunted for one brief moment if the submarine had any weapons left to fire. Release depth charges. Nakamura pulled the lever. 6 barrels of high explosive rolled off the stern and plunged into the sea that he counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the ocean erupted. A column of white water shot skyward, illuminated by the flash of underwater explosions. The Radford shook as if struck by a giant fist. And somewhere below, in the crushing darkness of the deep Pacific, a Japanese submarine was fighting for its life. 380 feet below the surface, Commander Yahachi Tanabe braced himself against the periscope housing as his submarine shuddered. The lights flickered twice and died. Emergency lanterns kicked in, casting the control room in a dim red glow that made every man's face look like it was already dead. Water sprayed from a cracked pipe overhead, cold enough to burn, and somewhere aft a sailor was screaming, a high, thin sound that meant a pressure seal had failed and a compartment was flooding. Tanabe did not panic. He had been commanding submarines since 1938. He had survived Pearl Harbor. He had survived Midway, where his boat, this boat, the I-168, had put 2 torpedoes into the crippled aircraft carrier USS Yorktown and sent her to the bottom. He had killed Americans before. He had expected to kill more tonight, that he had not expected this. Damage report, he said quietly. His executive officer, Lieutenant Kenji Mori, was already gathering information from the compartment chiefs. Forward torpedo room is secure. Engine room reports minor flooding, contained. Aft battery compartment has chlorine gas, sealed off. 6 men trapped inside. Chlorine gas. When seawater mixed with battery acid, it created a poison that burned the lungs from the inside out. The 6 men in that compartment would be dead within minutes, drowning in air they could not breathe. Tanabe closed his eyes briefly. Then he opened them and gave orders. Blow negative tanks. Take us to 400 feet. Rig for silent running. The submarine groaned as it descended deeper into the crushing pressure of the Pacific. At 400 feet, the hull was under nearly 200 pounds per square inch of stress. The I-168 was designed to withstand 300 feet safely. Below that, every foot was a gamble. Rivets could pop. Welds could crack. The sea could come rushing in with a pressure that would kill a man before he had time to understand he was dying. But at 400 feet, the American depth charges would pass above them. The Mark 7 had a maximum setting of 300 feet. If Tanabe could stay deep long enough, the destroyer would eventually lose contact and move on. If, above them, the propeller noise changed. The American ship was turning, circling back. He knows we're here, Mori whispered. How does he know? Tanabe had been asking himself the same question. The thermal layer should have scattered the sonar pulses. The I-168 was running silent, no engines, no pumps, no movement except the slow rotation of the planes to maintain depth. The American captain was hunting by instinct, by mathematics, by something that went beyond technology. The propeller noise grew louder. Directly overhead now. Brace for depth charges. The crew froze. In a submarine, you learn to read the sounds of death. The splash of barrels hitting the water. The click of the hydrostatic fuse arming. The faint whistle of explosives sinking toward you. Then the world ended. The first explosion hit like a hammer blow, throwing men against bulkheads and equipment. The second came a heartbeat later, closer, and the hull rang like a struck bell. Glass shattered. A man's arm broke with a crack that everyone heard. The lights died again, and this time they stayed dead. In the darkness, Tanabe counted survivors by their breathing. Ragged. Terrified. Alive. Damage report. It took longer this time. When Mori finally spoke, his voice was different. Forward trim tanks are ruptured. We're losing buoyancy. Diving planes are jammed at 15 degrees down. If we don't surface within 2 hours, we won't surface at all. 2 hours. The batteries were already draining. The air scrubbers were failing. 6 men were dead from chlorine gas, and 3 more were injured badly enough that they couldn't work. The I-168 was dying, and everyone aboard her knew it. Tanabe looked at his crew, 53 men who had followed him across the Pacific, who had trusted him to bring them home, who were now waiting for him to tell them whether they would live or die. Prepare for emergency surface action, he said. Gun crews will man the deck weapon. We will engage the destroyer and attempt to escape on diesel power. Mori stared at him. Sir, I know what it is. Tanabe's voice was calm. Almost gentle. The Americans have changed. They are not fighting like they did at the beginning. They are fighting like men who have nothing left to lose. If we stay down here, we die slowly. If we surface, we have a chance. It was not a large chance. The American destroyer had 5-inch guns that could tear the I-168 apart in minutes. The submarine's deck gun was a 4-inch weapon that required the crew to stand exposed on the hull, perfect targets for the destroyer's secondary armament, but at least they would die fighting. At least they would die in the open air, under the stars, instead of in this iron coffin where the walls were slowly crushing inward. Surface in 30 minutes, Tanabe ordered. All hands prepare for battle. The submarine began to rise. The submarine surfaced at dawn, 2 miles east of where Marcus Webb expected it, rising out of the morning sun like something born from fire and shadow. For a long moment, the I-168 simply floated there, black hull glistening, conning tower streaming seawater. Then the deck hatch opened and men began to climb out. Webb lowered his binoculars. There she is. The Radford had been circling for 4 hours, dropping depth charges at calculated intervals, forcing the submarine deeper and deeper into water that would eventually crush it. Webb had known the boat was damaged. He had tracked the oil slick spreading across the surface, marking the submarine's position as clearly as a bloodstain. He had been waiting, now the waiting was over. All ahead flank, he ordered. Come to bearing 090. Gun crews, prepare to engage. The destroyer surged forward, accelerating toward the wounded submarine with all the power her engines could deliver. At 35 knots, she covered 2 miles in less than 4 minutes. The Japanese gun crew was still scrambling to load their deck weapon when the Radford's forward 5-inch mount opened fire. The first shell missed, throwing up a geyser of water 50 yards beyond the submarine. The second shell struck the conning tower, tearing a hole in the steel and killing 3 men instantly. The third shell exploded on the deck, scattering the gun crew like leaves in a storm, but the I-168 did not surrender. Through his binoculars, Webb watched a single figure climb to the top of the damaged conning tower. The man wore a white officer's cap, the mark of a Japanese naval commander. He stood perfectly still as the Radford bore down on him, making no attempt to dive, no attempt to run. Webb understood. The submarine's diving planes were jammed. The ballast tanks were ruptured. The I-168 could not submerge. It could not escape. All it could do was die with dignity. Cease fire. The order surprised everyone on the bridge. Chief Harrison turned to look at Webb, his weathered face unreadable. Captain. I said cease fire. Webb was still watching the Japanese commander. Helm, hard right rudder. Bring us alongside. The Radford heeled sharply, her original ramming course bending into a tight curve that would bring her parallel to the submarine instead of through it. The Japanese commander watched the maneuver without moving. He understood what Webb was doing. He understood what it meant. The destroyer slowed to a stop 50 yards from the dying submarine. Water was pouring into the I-168's hull now, dragging her lower with every passing second. The surviving crew members were climbing out of hatches, jumping into the sea, swimming away from the sinking vessel that had been their home for months. "Deploy rescue nets," Webb ordered. "All hands, prepare to take on survivors." Ensign Nakamura was the first to reach the nets. He hung over the side of the Radford, extending his hand to the Japanese sailors struggling in the water, pulling them up one by one while the 5-inch guns fell silent and the morning sun climbed higher over the Pacific. He did not speak. Neither did the men he rescued. Language was unnecessary. They were all sailors. They all knew what drowning felt like. 43 Japanese sailors were pulled from the water. Commander Tanabe was among them, the last man to leave his ship, the last man to be rescued. He climbed the net slowly, his white cap still on his head, his uniform soaked with oil and seawater. When he reached the deck, he did not resist. He simply stood at attention and waited. Webb came down from the bridge. The two men faced each other in the morning light. Tanabe was older than Webb had expected, 40, perhaps 45, with gray streaking his close-cropped hair. His eyes were steady. Unafraid. He had killed Americans. He had watched his own men die. He had surfaced knowing it would cost him everything. Webb extended his hand. Tanabe looked at it for a long moment. Then he reached out and shook it. No words passed between them. None were needed. They had spent the night trying to kill each other, and they had both survived, and now they stood together on the deck of an American destroyer while the I-168 slipped beneath the waves and vanished forever. Behind them, the convoy was safe. 8,000 Marines would land on Bougainville in 2 days. The war would continue. More submarines would hunt. More destroyers would charge. More men would learn what it meant to become torpedoes, to close the distance between life and death until there was no distance left at all. But this morning, on this ship, 2 enemies shared a moment of silence. And when Nakamura brought tea to the wardroom an hour later, he found Webb and Tanabe sitting across from each other, neither speaking, neither looking away. The war had made them hunters. The night had made them survivors. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. The long silence after battle, when the mathematics of killing gave way to the simple truth that every man, on every side, was just trying to live long enough to see another dawn. The Radford turned west and sailed toward the rising sun. The sea behind her was empty, and the war went on.